In terms of addiction and overdose, a major problem has occurred in the last several years. Everyone knows about the opioid epidemic, and there are drugs for treating addiction of opioids. However, as we've seen, the increase in the number of addicts and overdoses has increased. And so what's being used now for treating addiction, I would call it treating a drug with another drug, hasn't worked as well as thought to be. And so what we're trying to do is use our own immune system, so stimulate our own immune system to actually attack these drugs. And so it's a vaccine. And vaccinology has its start, I guess, back in the year 1000 with Chinese, where they used a thing called variolation, where they would take pustules and actually put up people's noses as a way of immunizing. So over the years, vaccines have increased in their use. The reason why vaccines are so important is because they're very inexpensive. They're typically used in third world countries. How the vaccines work is we create a cocktail and we vaccinate the individual, and the individual makes antibodies against that drug. And so when they take the drug doesn't reach the pleasure centers in the brain, and so they don't have the addictive problems. The other thing that the vaccines can do is, if there's a potential overdose, they can reduce the amount of drug that gets in the brain. It can affect the cardiovascular system. This is how people have overdose and die. 8 to 10 years ago, I decided to look at heroin, not because there was a so-called heroin or opioid problem, was because in third world countries where injectable drug users were using heroin, we saw an increase in HIV. And so I thought the vaccines would be valuable in third world countries where there's a problem. That's not been our only drug. Well, over the years, the last 30 years, I've studied not just heroin, but I've studied cocaine, methamphetamine, nicotine, smoking. For nicotine is, instead of using the vaccine, I have an enzyme which degrades nicotine to non-psychoactive substance. And actually this enzyme comes out of China. It is found in a bacteria that lives off of, found in tobacco plants in China. It lives off of nicotine as its sole source of carbon and nitrogen. So I took the enzyme out of one of the pathways that the bacteria uses, and we found it's quite effective at reducing nicotine's psychoactive effects. Alcohol, we can't do alcohol, unfortunately. It's just too small of a molecule. That's the one substance use disorder we can't tackle. Can't do alcohol. And then more recently, we started to look at synthetic opioids several years ago because I could see this would become an issue because they're very easy to make and they're much more powerful. So the vaccines we've developed aren't just for heroin, but it will also work against synthetic opioids. And like I said, we've developed vaccines against cocaine, nicotine, methamphetamine, THC. So just about anything you can think of, we try to develop vaccines for against drugs of abuse. I'd say the main suppliers of the synthetic opioids is mostly coming out of China right now. A lot of illicit labs out of there that's being shipped in the U.S. Also Mexico. Of course, there's labs in the U.S. making this, but it's mainly coming out of China right now, the synthetic opioids. In fact, originally the synthetic opioids were introduced in the 80s, and one of them was called China White. My cocaine vaccine is being tested in phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, and we hope to get the heroin vaccine started within the next 20 months for testing. The vaccines, we believe the most effective use will be with people who are trying to undergo drug treatment therapy. So they're not going to be used as a panacea just to vaccinate people who aren't taking drugs. They're going to be useful for people who have a drug problem, want to stop taking the drug, but they tend to relapse, and the vaccines will be useful when people relapse. Most of the drugs that are being used now for treating addiction have to get into the brain and affect brain chemistry. And so we're not clever enough to do that. So the vaccine works by just blocking the drug from ever reaching the so-called pleasure centers in the brain. Say is that we need to do more research on drugs that we're using for chronic pain that are less addictive. And so that's something that's going to have to be investigated in the future by young people.